Hey ladies, welcome to the Grit, Growth, Grace podcast. If we haven't met, my name is Anne Marie. I'm wife to James and mom to 4 beautiful kids, plus 1 miscarried baby, from 9 months up to 8 years. My hope is to help other women experience the postpartum period all the way up to the first year of baby's life as a time of grit, growth, and grace. This is episode 22. Hey lady, today let's talk about your family planning options during postpartum, specifically comparing and contrasting hormonal birth control with natural family planning, also known as NFP, or as fertility awareness methods, FAMs, or even as fertility awareness-based methods, FABMs. Now, NFP historically has had a more religious connotation, whereas FAMs or FABMs have a more secular connotation. But each of these terms refers to making observations of biomarkers in your body to determine relative fertility versus infertility, and then adjusting sexual intimacy based on that. For that reason, you'll hear me use these terms interchangeably today, though I do acknowledge that some people make a distinction between the terms because of the philosophy behind each one. Here's what I want to cover today. Number 1, and this one will be pretty brief, but number 1, why hormonal contraception is off the table for me from a moral perspective, and how to simply and briefly explain your rationale to others if it's off the table for a moral reason for you too. Number 2, the 3 specific concerns I have with hormonal birth control use during the postpartum period, which are blood clots, mental health concerns, and effects on milk supply. Number 3, we'll cover the main types of modern, evidence-based FAMs or NFP methods, including mucus-only, symptothermal, and symptohormonal methods. And number 4, which will also be pretty brief, the particular challenges of using NFP during postpartum, which primarily have to do with changing fertility signs because of changing estrogen levels due to breastfeeding. Next week, in a part 2 to today's episode, I'll share my personal experience with several different FAMs, because I think it can be instructive and helpful to hear other women's experiences as we decide what might make the most sense for us. Let me set the stage with a story. So last month, I was editing a story about post-placental IUDs. And post-placental IUDs, or intrauterine device insertion, refers to exactly what it sounds like: inserting an IUD for contraception in a woman as soon as the placenta is birthed. Literally still in the hospital while she's still open. Even though, as you can imagine, if you are dilated, when the edit is put in, fully dilated, even though the rate of expulsion, which is just a fancy way of saying the IUD fell out, is much higher for post-placental IUDs, they have gained traction amongst some OBs because that way the woman is prevented from getting pregnant too soon if she doesn't come back for her 6-week postpartum checkup, when usually they would have the contraception conversation. So I was reading about this, and the question I was asking myself was, more generally, with that as a specific example, whether the way we do postpartum birth control, specifically in this country, is respectful to women's bodies and experiences. And that's kind of what I want to address today. How can we offer new moms effective family planning options that respect their bodies, their marriages, and their experiences? So first up, today, you might be in the same position as I, where contraception is a moral no-go for you based on your faith tradition or your religion, and you might struggle to succinctly communicate in a way that's not overly preachy or judgy just what that moral objection to contraception is. Now, I want to be clear. I think there are plenty of reasons that are not religious to oppose hormonal contraception. But I am going to address right now, first off, the religious or moral objections, because I think they can be tricky, especially if you're talking to somebody else who shares the same faith as you, but does not abide by your faith's prohibition. It might seem like, I'm not following the rules. Why are you? So here is what my husband and I used to communicate to couples when we taught marriage prep classes for our diocese. Contraception is a no-go because its purpose is always the sterilization of sex. Sterilization might sound like a strong word, but that's the goal of contraception. against the possibility of conception, or contraception, and it's either meant to be temporary, as with the pill or the patch, or to an extent, the IUD or the arm shot, or permanent sterilization, as with tubal ligation. And the reason contraception is a no-go is because it prevents my and my husband's love from being free, total, faithful, and fruitful or life-giving. And the reason our married love must needs to be free, total, faithful, and fruitful or life-giving is because it's intended to mirror the sacrificial love of Christ showed to us when he died on the cross. Contraception prevents that total gift of myself, including my fertility, to my spouse, and it prevents my reception of the totality of who he is as a person, including his fertility. So contraception is a no-go because it rules out the possibility of living my vocational call, what I said yes to on my wedding day, to free, total, faithful, and fruitful love. Okay, on to number 2. 3 concerns that I have about hormonal birth control, specifically during postpartum. But first, it's just occurring to me, maybe I should cover the 3 ways or mechanisms of action that hormonal birth control works. I talk about and read about and write about these things all day long for my job, but maybe you don't for yours. And it's connected to this point, the 3 specific concerns I have. So here are the 3 basic ways hormonal birth control works, whether it's a pill, patch, ring, etc. And as long as it has both synthetic estrogen and progesterone, which is known as progestin, in it. The most important way hormonal birth control works is by preventing ovulation. Now, you are smart, you are a big girl, and you can understand how ovulation works. You can. I will let you look that up for yourself. The simplest way to refer to the most important parts of the process is this. There's an incredible symphony of hormones that tells your uterine lining to thicken and an egg to mature, and then estrogen to rise, and then that mature egg to be released, which is ovulation. But the progestin, and mostly the progestin, in hormonal birth control maintains steady, low levels in your system, preventing the rise and fall of hormones. Preventing ovulation is the biggest thing hormonal birth control does. But progestin also thickens the cervical mucus so that sperm can't get through and swim up to reach a newly ovulated mature egg for fertilization, just in case ovulation wasn't prevented. And that is referred to as breakthrough ovulation. So stopping ovulation and thickening cervical mucus. Okay. But the third mechanism is that when you've got these steady, low levels of progestin that keep the uterine lining, the lining of your womb, thin, think unfriendly to a newly conceived life. So hormonal birth control works, number 1, by preventing ovulation. If that fails, number 2, it should prevent fertilization by keeping the sperm from swimming to meet a mature egg. And if that fails, number 3, and fertilization does occur and you've conceived a new life, the last backup option is that the uterine lining should be too thin for implantation to occur. This is why you might have heard that hormonal birth control can be abortifacient, because it renders a woman's womb inhospitable to the implantation of a brand new life. All right, so the 3 concerns I have with hormonal birth control postpartum. Number 1, blood clot risk. Your risk of blood clots is already higher, just naturally, during pregnancy and the first 18 weeks postpartum, roughly 4 months, due to elevated estrogen. This is without hormonal birth control. But the synthetic estrogen in hormonal birth control further raises that risk. This is why women aren't started on hormonal birth control in that first 6 weeks after birth, when the risk is highest. But you should know that if you started at 6 weeks and your risk doesn't go back to normal, pre-pregnancy risk for blood clots, until 18 weeks, you are experiencing an elevated risk of blood clots from your hormonal birth control for approximately 3 months. Now, the absolute risk, the actual likelihood of blood clots happening to you is not high. But it is real, and the question you have to ask yourself is it necessary to incur that risk? Do you have other options? I would say you do. Number 2, mental health concerns. We know that hormonal birth control use can be detrimental to women's health, especially the younger they are when they start it. Risk of depression, suicidal ideation, and attempts is highest in adolescent girls who start the pill or other forms of hormonal birth control compared to adult women. Now, this seems to be because some women are more sensitive from a mental health perspective to the hormonal changes brought on by the steady low levels of progesterone and estrogen compared to what your natural levels would be. And in fact, we know that when women have had anxiety or depression related to their hormonal birth control in the past, those women are at higher risk for postpartum depression later on down the road. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the hormonal birth control caused their postpartum depression, but it means that developing an anxiety or depression after starting birth control should be a big red flag that this woman may be particularly mentally and emotionally sensitive to big hormonal changes, just like those that occur during pregnancy and postpartum, especially that big hormonal drop postpartum. But you and I also know that postpartum can be a hard time emotionally, just naturally, without adding that potential variable of hormonal birth control into the mix. How is a woman who's taking hormonal birth control in her postpartum year and develops anxiety, depression, OCD, etc., how is she to know if this is her or the hormonal birth control? There's a really excellent article on the Romper website spotlighting new moms who are shunning hormonal birth control postpartum. I love the way they phrase this, and this is the beginning of their quote. After dealing with the intense body and brain hijacking hormonal changes that can occur during pregnancy and the postpartum period, the last thing many new mothers want is to introduce yet another variable into the mix. So much of the perinatal period is spent questioning your own mental and physical reactions. Are they hormone-driven or are they real? And just because they may be hormone-driven, does that necessarily mean they're not real? Much of the aversion to hormonal birth control by new moms is a desire to simplify those questions. Another way of saying they want to feel like themselves again. End quote. The Romper article specifically quoted a woman named Emily who said, "My whole reaction to being asked to go on hormonal birth control after giving birth to a baby is, how dare you ask me to do anything else?" This woman's husband has so far declined to get a vasectomy, the article says. "I took the pill to keep us from getting pregnant when we didn't want to get pregnant. When we wanted to get pregnant, I created and birthed and nursed our children. My body has been through the ringer. I have done my part." End quote. This touches, too, on the question earlier of whether hormonal birth control respects women's relationships and marriages by requiring the woman to bear all the responsibility and weight of family planning, or whether there are options that help her share the load more equitably with her husband for family planning. Okay. Third concern with hormonal birth control postpartum, what it does to your milk supply. Now, here's the conventional advice you'll receive. You will be told if you're going to take estrogen and progestin-containing birth control, like the pill, just don't take it for the first 6 weeks because the estrogen could tank your milk supply. So wait till your milk supply is well established. But here's the actual truth. According to the La Leche League International, even if you wait until your milk supply is well established to start combination birth control, meaning estrogen containing, it can still diminish your milk supply and lead to an early cessation of breastfeeding. And here's the other thing. You will also hear, oh, well, if you're concerned about that, just take progestin-only birth control that doesn't contain any estrogen at all. Well, La Leche League says that has some evidence that it also, even without the estrogen, can impact your milk supply too. And you might be wondering tangentially whether the hormones in your body will transfer to your baby through your breast milk. And the answer is, we don't really know. Because the little bit of research we have is primarily very old, think over 40 years, and we aren't really able to accurately measure just how much estrogen and progestin a baby might be receiving and how it could impact his or her health down the road. I will link to a great article about this week as well. Okay. There's one other thing I wanted to say on this topic of hormonal birth control use postpartum, and it's a little bit more global because it's not limited to the postpartum period. It's a critique of hormonal birth control use in general. And the critique is this. Hormonal birth control use prevents the woman from the health benefits of ovulation. Now, that's something you don't generally hear about, the health benefits of ovulation. In fact, generally you hear quite the opposite, that you don't need to have a period. That's what the ads say, right? Periods are just unnecessary and useless and left over from archaic times. Well, not quite. Ovulation can impact your brain health, bone health, breast health, heart health, immune health, and the inflammatory process of menstruation, your period, specifically prepares your body to handle future pregnancies well with the inflammation that they naturally entail. So that's a critique I have of hormonal birth control in general, and that's one of the non-religious reasons that I do not advocate for it. Okay, so those are my concerns about hormonal birth control use postpartum. Blood clot risk, mental health concerns, milk supply issues, possible impact to the baby is kind of a part B to that milk supply one, and then missing out on the health benefits of regular ovulation. Let's do now a flyover review of the modern evidence-based FAMs or methods of NFP. There are 3 primary types. Mucus only, like with the Creighton method, where the woman relies exclusively on cervical mucus observations as indicators of fertility or infertility. There are symptothermal methods, like the couple-to-couple method or CCL, and those utilize both the symptom of cervical mucus plus temperature readings. That's the thermal and symptothermal. And then they have an optional 3rd sign of cervical position checking. There are also symptohormonal methods like the Marquette method, which tests hormone metabolites in your urine, which just means the byproducts that hormones break down to in your pee. Now, the Marquette method gives qualitative readings like high or low to indicate high or low fertility or likelihood of conceiving. Newer monitors like the Mira monitor and the Inito monitor are quantitative. And what that means is that they give you an actual number. So you would then use a protocol to determine whether you are fertile or infertile. So I'm just making up a number here, but let's say your estrogen was 100. So if you were over 100, you would say, yep, I'm potentially fertile today. If you were less than 100, you could confidently say, nope, I'm unlikely to be fertile today. So I also want to briefly mention under the symptohormonal methods category, I would include the Boston cross-check method. Now, this is a newer method, and it simply means that you can check a combination of different signs. So you might choose to use the Marquette method monitor, but then perhaps also do temperature. Or you might do cervical mucus and the Marquette monitor. So you could do a combination in the Boston cross-check. You're doing one method and then cross-checking it with another. Now, there is solid research out there for the pregnancy prevention effectiveness of mucus-only methods, the symptothermal method, and symptohormonal methods. And if you sign up for my email list, this week I will include links taking you to the effectiveness stats for pregnancy prevention for multiple modern evidence-based fertility awareness methods. And this can be especially helpful if you have a doctor, midwife, or somebody else who's taking care of you, who's a little resistant or perhaps just less familiar, maybe doesn't have much knowledge of the evidence behind modern methods of family planning and thinks, oh, that's just the rhythm method or that's just the calendar method and it doesn't work. The CDC updated its own effectiveness stats for fertility awareness methods in the last couple of years, but not everybody is aware of that change yet. And so there are still plenty of people out there who believe that fertility awareness methods are all the rhythm method and that they don't work. So this week's email will include links so that if that is your situation and you just need to know what those numbers are and how they compare to hormonal birth control methods, including with their typical use, which is how most people use them, I got you covered. Those will be in the email. I also want you to encourage you, specifically during the postpartum period, to look into the lactational amenorrhea method, or LAM. It has surprisingly simple rules or questions to ask yourself to see if you qualify to use it. And if you do qualify, it guarantees with 98% accuracy that your fertility won't return in the first 6 months. Please do know that the LAM method, I guess that was redundant, that LAM is different from ecological breastfeeding, even though they tend to be conflated when you hear about them. Ecological breastfeeding tends to delay return of fertility much longer than 6 months, but it also has much more stringent requirements in terms of how often you breastfeed, using breastfeeding as a pacifier, sleeping practices, etc. Last but not least, Number 4, several things you need to know about natural family planning or fertility awareness use during postpartum specifically. Number 1, it will respect your marriage, meaning that it allows for free, total, faithful, and fruitful or life-giving love to be exchanged between spouses and does not purposefully reject you or your spouse's fertility. Now, that does not mean that every time you have sex, you are trying to have a baby. It means that if you are not trying to have a baby, that you would wait to have sex until the parts of your cycle where you are naturally or already infertile. 2, you also need to know charting while breastfeeding can be tricky. Because your hormone levels and particularly your estrogen fluctuate, that can lead to changes in your fertility signs, like the appearance of your cervical mucus and what your Marquette method monitor is reading. Those signs may or may not indicate that your fertility is returning. I'm going to get into this next time. My experience with the revolving door of changing fertility signs and the frustration of extended periods of abstinence during postpartum because we simply didn't know whether this time it was for real or not. Another thing you should know is that when you use NFP or FAMS postpartum, you don't need to worry that you're increasing your risk of blood clots, threatening your milk supply, or potentially endangering your mental health. You should also know charting your cycle during postpartum needs to be done with a trained instructor in your method. Please do not DIY this and then think you're going to successfully avoid pregnancy. Yes, this is your body, and yes, you are absolutely capable of identifying the signals it sends you, but you also need to work with a guide who can help you interpret those signals and how to respond to them in light of your family planning goals. All right, lady, I think that's plenty for today. Next week, let's talk about what a lived experience of different FAMs might look like. I'll talk to you then.